My name is Julie Kafka. I'm a doctoral student in the Department of Health Behavior at UNC Gillings. I do research on intimate partner violence prevention, and I've had the privilege of working with violent death reporting system data for a few projects that I'll get to talk about with you all today. So, a quick definition to start. Intimate partner violence is any physical, sexual, or psychological harm perpetrated by a current or former intimate partner. And although the terms are a little different, you can think of this as domestic violence for our purposes today. IPV has serious consequences in terms of physical injury, emotional impacts, mental health impacts, and it takes a huge economic toll on a survivor and their family. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm focused exclusively on fatal IPV. And when researchers look at fatal IPV, they tend to focus exclusively on intimate partner homicides, particularly intimate partner homicide of women. And that's appropriate because when women are murdered in the United States, over half of the time they're killed by a current or former intimate partner. So this is staggering. This is really important to be looking at, but it's also not the only thing that's going on. IPV can also affect men, transgender folks, non-gender binary folks, and it can also result in other fatal outcomes besides partner homicide. Why do we need to look at these other outcomes? Because fatal IPV is preventable, and if we can understand more about who it's affecting, how and under what circumstances using a broad and comprehensive lens, then we can do better to intervene. So I've talked about intimate partner homicide a bit. That's when an individual kills their current or former intimate partner. But there's also something called corollary victimization. That's when someone outside of an abusive relationship is killed as part of an IPV incident. That might be a new boyfriend, a new girlfriend, another dating partner, a child, a family member. So that's all important to take into account. There's also homicide-suicide, which is often when an abusive partner commits an intimate partner homicide or another IPV-related homicide, and then dies by suicide within 24 hours. There's also single suicide events, which is when someone affected by IPV dies by suicide in the absence of a homicide or other fatal violent incident. And then there's legal intervention deaths. This is when an individual is killed by active duty law enforcement. And legal intervention deaths have received greater attention in the media recently, and rightfully so. There's a lot to look at there. For our purposes, we're only going to talk about that in the context of IPV calls. And it is relatively less common than these other outcomes, so it's not really our focus today. But VDRS has great data on legal intervention for those of you who are doing that research. So some of the questions that have driven my work is, what is the total contribution of IPV to fatal violence, and who is it affecting? Fortunately, the violent death reporting system has a variable that is dedicated to picking up intimate partner violence circumstances. And so the first project that I'll talk about with you all today really focuses on the power of this one variable. This project I did was actually with Colorado violent death reporting system data, but all states funded by the CDC to do VDRS use the same codebook and have the same general infrastructure. So just using that intimate partner violence variable, we found that it picks up a lot of intimate partner homicide deaths, but it's also being used to identify corollary victimization, and then we can link those known IPV homicides with any other death that shares the same incident identifier in the VDRS system. So for example, if there was an intimate partner homicide followed by the perpetrator's suicide, those two deaths would share an incident ID. So by linking incident IDs within VDRS, we could identify, for example, a homicide-suicide, even if that suicide wasn't originally coded with the IPV variable. So these results show both the IPV variable and all related deaths for those IPV incidents. So digging deeper, what's great about VDRS is it has really rich, nuanced circumstance and demographic detail about who's been killed and what's going on there. So this is looking at gender differences. While VDRS does have some newer variables for transgender and non-gender binary folks, unfortunately those variables just aren't reliable yet. There's a lot of missing. So rather than present misleading information there, I'm only looking at male and female, unfortunately. Males are depicted here in navy. Females, are in gray. As you can see, women in Colorado experience higher rates of IPV, of intimate partner homicide specifically here, compared to men, although men are also dying by IPH. If we look at these other outcomes though, you can see that males experience higher rates of corollary victimization, homicide, suicide, and legal intervention death. Pretty interesting. Don't have time to go into the ramifications of that here, but VDRS provides a really great jumping off point to look at these nuances and to understand circumstances here. When we look at the primary weapon, you can see really across the board, firearms are the main weapon being used to perpetrate IPV-related fatalities. We also did an interesting sub-analysis to look at how socioeconomic status may be a driver of intimate partner violence-related deaths. We have information in the violent death reporting system on the decedent county of residence, and we use that information to calculate rates of IPV-related death at the community level based on community poverty. So we got community poverty information from the census. This is just another way that different data sources can really complement each other and talk to each other well. So along the x-axis, you can see on the left-hand side, we have information on low poverty communities, whereas on the right-hand side, that last box, or that set of boxes, is showing the IPV-related death rate for communities in Colorado where 30% or more of the population is living at or below the federal poverty level. So we can really see that communities that face higher poverty rates also face higher rates of IPV-related violent deaths. So there's more analyses here that I don't have time to go into, but again, VDRS has a lot to offer. You can dig into victim demographics like marital status, age, circumstances like reported mental health problems, and so much more. Our full report, all of the analyses we ran, are available as a handout on the Colorado Department of Public Health website at the link below. This brings me to the North Carolina project, where we wanted to take a step beyond the IPV variable in VDRS to see what it might be missing. I'll bring up the codebook definition for the IPV variable again, just to show you that it really nudges abstractors to only code for IPV for homicides and legal intervention deaths. It makes no mention of suicides. Instead, there's a variable called intimate partner problems, which can be applied to any suicides where there's some mention of problems with a current or former intimate partner that may have contributed to the suicide. So this can pick up cases where there was maybe a breakup, a disagreement, a divorce, but it could have also been, it could also be coded in a case where someone had threatened to kill their intimate partner, someone was slapped or hit by an intimate partner, or someone was sexually abusing their intimate partner. Only these latter examples really constitute IPV. The intimate partner problems variable is noisy. It's picking up a lot of stuff, right? That's not IPV related. That doesn't that doesn't meet that threshold of violence. But as IPV researchers, we can use it to at least pick out cases where there might be intimate partner violence going on. So that's exactly what we did. We basically looked at all cases, all suicides where intimate partner problems were indicated, and we read in detail these death narratives to see if there was maybe more explicit mention of partner violence. Death narratives are available for all cases with circumstance information in VDRS, and they just provide a narrative description of what was known about the death. So you can go into further detail, and it's a really great tool for researchers. So to recap our methods, we looked at violent deaths in North Carolina among residents. We only looked at deaths with known circumstances. Data that's the CDC guidance is to follow that protocol. We excluded unintentional deaths, focused on intentional violence only. We used the IPV variable to identify intimate partner homicides and corollary deaths. We linked deaths by incident ID to find multiple homicides or homicide-suicides related to IPV. And then with the remaining single incident suicides, we narrowed it down to cases where intimate partner problems or stalking were already indicated. We read those death narratives and we discerned for ourselves if there was evidence or mention of partner violence. And here's what we found. Over 10% of all intentional violent deaths in North Carolina might be related to intimate partner violence, and that's an underestimate. We were pretty conservative in how we coded, and there's often details missing from the violent death reporting system. If someone doesn't mention something to the police, or it doesn't come up in the medical examiner report, it's simply not recorded. So this is an underestimate. Even with that said, the age-adjusted rate of IPV-related deaths in North Carolina is fairly close to the HIV mortality rate. So overall, this is pretty noteworthy. This is startlingly common. Well, common relatively speaking, in terms of its contribution to violent deaths. So this is the breakdown by subtypes. You can see pretty clearly, pretty immediately that IPV can lead to both homicide and suicide. Single suicides have been particularly ignored. They're not systematically measured or assessed, but clearly they are present. And if we only take intimate partner homicides into account, we're really missing 60% of all IPV-related deaths. All of our results are written up in this article. The citation is below, or you can reach out to me if you have any questions or you'd like to learn more. So briefly, some next steps. My colleague, Dr. Lori Graham at the University of Maryland, is launching a study to kind of replicate our methods to see how IPV-related deaths manifest, particularly for youth, and she'll be using multi-state data. I'm hoping to similarly replicate the findings using multi-state violent death reporting system data focused exclusively on the overlap between IPV and single suicides. Who is this affecting and under what circumstances? Do we need to be systematically collecting data in VDRS information on how IPV contributes to suicides? There's a lot of implications for practice to take away here. First, all people, regardless of gender, are affected by IPV, and we have the opportunity to involve men and boys in prevention earlier on rather than just focusing on women, and we also need to do better to think about transgender and non-gender binary folks. We saw that firearms were used across the board in IPV-related deaths as the primary weapon, and legal mechanisms already exist to separate IPV perpetrators from firearms. We need to ensure that these laws are being implemented thoroughly. I didn't discuss this here today, but most of these fatal IPV incidents occur in homes, and so we need to make sure there's funding for shelters and alternative housing for victims and their families. We also need to prevent IPV early on before it can hide behind closed doors. People with fewer resources and opportunities may be more likely to experience fatal IPV, so more attention to reducing poverty to ultimately reduce violence is merited. And finally, preventing IPV can save lives. Many more lives than I think we would have recognized before when we can see the true impact. So thank you so much for your time today. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, and I appreciate you taking the time.